It was one of those nights that felt heavier than it should. The kind that settles deep in your chest and whispers that something is about to go wrong. I stood at the deserted bus stop, shifting my weight from one foot to the other as the air grew colder. The streetlights flickered above me, casting long, jittering shadows on the empty pavement. The city had gone quiet, save for the occasional hum of a distant engine or the rustle of trash swept up by the wind. My phone had died hours ago, leaving me stranded without the luxury of calling a cab or checking the time. The bus was my last hope, the last bus. When the headlights finally appeared in the distance, they felt more like a warning than a sign of salvation. The vehicle emerged slowly from the darkness, its bulky shape silhouetted against the faint glow of the distant skyline. As it drew closer, I noticed how dilapidated it looked. The once bright paint was chipped and peeling, leaving jagged streaks of rust along its frame. The windows were dark, almost black, reflecting nothing but the occasional gleam of passing streetlights. The sign above the windshield flickered erratically, but I could just make out the words. Last journey. I laughed nervously. That's ominous, I muttered, more to myself than to anyone else. Still, what choice did I have? I stepped forward as the bus came to a stop with a loud, groaning hiss. The door creaked open, and a sharp gust of cold air swept out, chilling me to the bone. The driver was barely visible in the dim cabin, but what little I could see of him set my nerves on edge. His face was hidden in shadow, and his hands, pale, almost skeletal, gripped the steering wheel tightly. He didn't look at me, didn't say a word, just sat there, motionless. I hesitated for a moment before climbing the steps. The interior smelled faintly of damp fabric and something else, something metallic and sour that made my stomach twist. As the door clanged shut behind me, I took a shaky breath and moved down the aisle. The passengers sat scattered throughout the bus, their forms rigid and unnervingly still. Most of them were dressed in outdated clothes, faded suits, old-fashioned hats, long dresses with fraying hems. No one turned to look at me as I passed. Their faces, partially obscured by the dim light, were blank and expressionless, their eyes fixed straight ahead. The bus rumbled to life again, jerking forward without warning. I stumbled slightly, gripping the back of a nearby seat for balance before finding one of my own near the middle of the aisle. As I settled in, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a terrible mistake. The windows were tinted so darkly that I couldn't see anything outside, save for the occasional blur of light or shadow as we passed something or someone. The city should have been alive with activity at this hour, even in the quieter neighborhoods. But all I could see was an oppressive black void pressing against the glass. Time felt slippery, like it was being stretched and compressed all at once. I couldn't tell if we'd been riding for 10 minutes or an hour. The low hum of the engine was the only sound, a constant drone that buzzed in my ears and drowned out my thoughts. I glanced around again, hoping to catch someone's eye, maybe start a conversation to break the eerie silence. But no one moved. Not the old woman clutching a handbag in the front row, not the man in a suit sitting rigidly by the window, not the teenager slumped in his seat near the back. They all seemed frozen, like statues that I tried not to stare, but something about their stillness was deeply unsettling. My eyes lingered on the old woman. Her hands, clasped tightly around the handle of her bag, were unnaturally pale, the knuckles sharp and pronounced. Her face was turned slightly away from me, but I could see enough to notice the unnerving smoothness of her skin. Too smooth, like polished porcelain. My gaze shifted to the man in the suit. His head was tilted at an odd angle, as if his neck couldn't support its weight. His lips were thin and colorless, and his eyes, half-lidded, stared blankly at the seat in front of him. A shiver ran down my spine. I tried to focus on the window instead, hoping the passing scenery might distract me, but it was no use. The darkness outside seemed alive, shifting and writhing as if it were trying to push its way inside. The bus didn't stop. We passed bus stops and intersections, their faint outlines flashing by, but the driver never slowed. I felt a rising sense of panic, my earlier discomfort hardening into something more urgent. I turned toward the driver, leaning slightly into the aisle. "Excuse me?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the oppressive silence. "Where is this bus going?" He didn't respond. His hands didn't move. The only sign that he was even alive was the faint, rhythmic movement of his shoulders as he breathed. If he heard me, he gave no indication that I sank back into my seat, my pulse quickening. A nagging thought crept into my mind, one I didn't want to acknowledge. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right, as if on cue. A faint noise broke the silence. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew steadily louder. A soft, rasping whisper coming from somewhere behind me. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. Slowly, I turned my head to look. The back of the bus was darker than the rest, the weak overhead lights failing to penetrate the shadows. But I could just make out a figure slouched in the last row, their form barely visible. "Don't look back." The words came out in a strained, hollow whisper, like they'd been forced through a throat caked with dust. My chest tightened as the figure shifted slightly, their head tilting toward me. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their gaze, heavy and full of something I couldn't name. "What?" I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. "Don't look back," the figure repeated. Then they fell silent, slumping deeper into the shadows until they were no longer visible. I whipped my head around, my breathing ragged. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure everyone on the bus could hear it. But when I looked again at the other passengers, they were as still and lifeless as before. What did they mean? "Don't look back." My fingers dug into the worn seat beneath me as I fought the urge to glance over my shoulder again. The bus seemed to hum louder, the vibrations seeping into my bones. Every instinct screamed at me to get off this bus. But how? It hadn't stopped once since I'd gotten on. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The driver would know, he had to. Summoning what little courage I had left, I stood and began walking toward the front of the bus. The closer I got, the colder the air became. My breath puffed out in faint clouds, visible in the dim light. The driver's form loomed ahead, his shoulders unnaturally broad, his posture rigid. "Excuse me," I said again, louder this time. My voice cracked. "Where are we going? Why haven't we stopped?" He didn't respond. His hands remained fixed on the steering wheel, his head tilted slightly forward. "Hey!" I shouted, desperation creeping into my voice. "I need to get off this bus." The moment the words left my mouth, the hum of the engine shifted. It grew deeper, resonating in a way that made my teeth ache. The air felt thicker, pressing down on me like an invisible weight, and then the driver moved, slowly. His head turned toward me, the shadow obscuring his face dissolving just enough for me to see his eyes. Black, empty pits that seemed to pull the light from the room. "Too late," he said, his voice low and guttural. "You're already on the journey." The driver's words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. My legs felt weak, and my throat tightened as if an invisible hand was wrapped around it. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the sight of those black, hollow eyes robbed me of any courage I had left. What do you mean?" I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer. His gaze lingered on me for a moment longer before he turned back to the road, or whatever void stretched endlessly beyond the bus's windshield. The rumbling engine seemed louder now, each vibration shaking me to my core. The thought of returning to my seat felt unbearable. The idea of staying close to him was worse. I stood frozen, caught between two unbearable options, until a soft sound behind me broke my paralysis. A shuffle. I spun around. The passengers, once deathly still, were moving. It was subtle at first. An old woman's head turned slightly toward me, her lifeless eyes glinting in the faint light. The man in the suit tilted his head back, his mouth slack and jaw unhinged in a grotesque yawn that seemed far too wide. Even the teenager shifted, his limbs creaking like rusty hinges. Panic clawed at my chest. I stumbled back down the aisle, the narrow path between the seats suddenly feeling like a trap. The passengers' movements grew more pronounced as I passed. They turned to watch me, their heads swiveling unnaturally on stiff necks. Their mouths moved as if trying to speak, but no words came out. Only a faint, collective wheeze, like the sigh of air escaping from an old balloon. That I hurried back to my seat, gripping the armrest so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My breathing was erratic, shallow gasps that I couldn't control. My mind screamed at me to do something, anything, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The passengers had all turned toward me now. Their faces, illuminated faintly by the flickering overhead lights, were distorted, like reflections in a funhouse mirror. Eyes too large, mouths stretched too wide, skin too smooth or too cracked. They weren't human anymore. If they ever had been. As the moments dragged on, the wheezing sound grew louder, morphing into something more rhythmic, almost like chanting. The passengers' mouths moved in unison, their voices merging into a low, guttural hum that seemed to reverberate in my chest. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it did little to block out the sound. The hum wasn't just a noise. It was a presence, crawling under my skin, burrowing into my thoughts. It grew louder and louder, an unbearable crescendo that threatened to shatter me. "Stop!" I screamed, my voice cracking. And just like that, the noise ceased. The sudden silence was almost worse. I slowly lowered my hands, my ears ringing from the absence of sound. The passengers remained motionless again, their faces still turned toward me, their empty eyes unblinking. I looked back toward the driver. He hadn't reacted, hadn't so much as flinched during the commotion. He just sat there, his hands gripping the wheel, staring straight ahead. The dark windows reflected his still form, and beyond that, nothing. Just the oppressive void that seemed to stretch on forever. The bus jerked suddenly, throwing me against the armrest. I winced, clutching my side as the vehicle's speed increased. It was as if the bus had come alive, barreling forward with reckless abandon. My stomach lurched as the vehicle swerved, the tires screeching against the unseen road. "What the hell is happening?" I shouted, half to myself, half to anyone who might answer. But there was no response, only the relentless roar of the engine and the faint rattling of the bus frame. That I glanced toward the back of the bus, half expecting to see the shadowy figure who had whispered to me earlier, but their seat was empty now. Fear gnawed at the edges of my mind as I tried to make sense of everything. Who were these people? Why was the bus moving so fast? Where was it even going? I thought about pulling the cord to signal a stop, but when I looked up, I realized there wasn't one. The absence sent a fresh wave of panic coursing through me. What kind of bus didn't have a stop cord? Before I could dwell on it further, the old woman in the front row shifted again. Her movements were jerky, like a marionette controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. Slowly, she rose from her seat, her frail body trembling as she turned to face me fully. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, I saw emotion flicker across her face. "Pity? You shouldn't have boarded," she croaked, her voice barely audible over the rumble of the engine. I stared at her, my mouth dry. What are you talking about?" She didn't answer. Instead, she raised a trembling hand and pointed toward the door at the front of the bus. "Leave, before it's too late." Her words sent chills racing down my spine. I opened my mouth to respond, but the bus lurched violently again, and I was thrown forward against the seat in front of me. When I looked up, the old woman had collapsed back into her seat. Her body limp. I scrambled to my feet, gripping the headrest for support as the bus continued to swerve and rattle. My instincts screamed at me to heed her warning. I stumbled toward the front of the bus, each step feeling heavier than the last. The driver didn't react to my approach, his focus fixed on the black void outside. "Stop the bus!" I shouted, my voice tinged with desperation. "Let me off." He didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. It was like I wasn't even there. That I reached for the handle of the door, hoping against hope that I could pry it open myself. My fingers brushed against the cold metal, and the instant I touched it, the chanting started again. It was louder this time, more frantic, the passengers' guttural hum filling the air with a suffocating intensity. I turned to see them all standing now, their faces contorted in grotesque expressions of rage and despair. They moved toward me in jerky, unnatural steps, their mouths stretched open in soundless screams. Panic overtook me. I yanked at the door handle, pulling with every ounce of strength I had. It wouldn't budge. The metal was freezing under my fingers, burning my skin as I struggled to force it open. The chanting grew louder, the passengers drawing closer. Their movements were erratic, their bodies bending and twisting in ways that defied logic. One of them, a man with half his face missing, reached out toward me, his skeletal hand inches from my arm with a final, desperate tug. The door gave way. The freezing wind outside hit me like a wall, stealing the breath from my lungs. The void beyond the bus wasn't empty. It was alive, swirling with shadows and flickering lights that seemed to beckon me. I hesitated for only a second before stepping through. The moment I stepped through the door, the cold consumed me. It wasn't just a physical chill. It was something deeper, more primal. A gnawing frost that clawed at my soul. My breath hitched as I stumbled into the darkness. The bus's door snapping shut behind me with a metallic clang. I expected to hit solid ground. But there was nothing beneath my feet. I plummeted, the air rushing past me in a dizzying blur. My stomach lurched as I tumbled through the void, the oppressive blackness stretching infinitely in every direction. There were no landmarks, no stars, no sense of up or down. Just endless, formless nothingness. A strange sound accompanied my fall. A low, rhythmic thrum, like a heartbeat echoing through a vast cavern. It grew louder with every passing second, vibrating through my chest and rattling my bones. Panic took hold of me as I flailed, grasping desperately for something, anything, to stop my descent. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the fall ended that I landed on solid ground with a bone-jarring thud. Pain shot through my body, and I groaned as I tried to catch my breath. The surface beneath me felt cold and slick, like polished stone, but the darkness made it impossible to see. I reached out, my fingers brushing against a rough, uneven texture that felt almost organic, like the bark of an ancient tree. The rhythmic thrum was louder now, pounding steadily like the pulse of a living creature. It seemed to emanate from the ground itself, resonating beneath my palms. I struggled to my feet, my legs trembling as I tried to steady myself. That's when I saw it. A faint, flickering light in the distance, barely more than a pinprick. It hovered like a star lost in the void, its dim glow casting long, shifting shadows. I didn't know where I was or what had happened, but the light was the only anchor in this abyss. I started toward it. The journey felt endless, the light never seeming to grow closer no matter how far I walked. The ground beneath me was uneven, the occasional jagged ridge catching my foot and sending me stumbling. My breaths came in shallow gasps, the air thick and heavy, as though I were inhaling smoke. Time lost all meaning. For all I knew, I could have been walking for minutes or hours or days. The light flickered and wavered, sometimes dimming to almost nothing, only to flare up again with a ghostly brilliance. The first sound came without warning. A faint whisper, barely audible over the thrum of the ground. I froze, my body tensing as I strained to listen. The whisper was soft, almost tender, but its tone was wrong, like the voice of someone trying to imitate human speech but not quite understanding it. "You shouldn't have left?" I whipped around, searching the darkness for the source of the voice, but there was nothing there. My skin prickled, the sensation of unseen eyes crawling over me. I quickened my pace, the light ahead now my only focus. "You don't belong." The whisper came again, this time closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I broke into a stumbling run. The ground seemed to shift beneath me, the slick stone undulating like a living thing. The light grew brighter, its glow cutting through the suffocating darkness. "Turn back, before it's too late." The voice was everywhere now, surrounding me, reverberating inside my skull. It wasn't just one voice. It was many, layered on top of each other. A cacophony of whispers that made my head throb. I clutched at my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. "Stop it!" I shouted, my voice hoarse and cracking. "Leave me alone." The whispers fell silent. For a brief, blissful moment, there was nothing but the steady hum of the ground beneath me. Then the light ahead flickered again, brighter this time, revealing a massive shape looming just beyond it. The shape resolved into something vaguely recognizable as I drew closer, a building or what was left of one. Its structure was jagged and warped, its walls leaning at impossible angles. The material was strange, Neither stone nor metal, but something in between, with a dull, matte surface that seemed to absorb the light around it. A door stood at the center of the structure, its surface covered in strange, swirling patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The light I'd been following emanated from the door's edges, a faint, pulsating glow that drew me in despite every instinct screaming for me to turn back. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the strange material. The whispers had gone silent, and the oppressive hum of the ground seemed to fade the closer I got to the door. For the first time since stepping off the bus, I felt a faint glimmer of hope. Maybe this was a way out. Maybe. The door opened and I stumbled back as a figure emerged, its silhouette backlit by the pulsating light. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its form was elongated and angular, its limbs too long, its movements unervingly fluid. Its head tilted toward me, and I felt its gaze even though it had no visible eyes. "You have arrived," it said, its voice low and resonant, vibrating through the air like the echo of a distant bell. "The journey is complete." I shook my head, my voice trembling. I don't understand. Where am I? What is this place?" The figure took a step closer, and I instinctively backed away, my heels scraping against the slick ground. "You boarded the bus," it said simply, as though that explained everything. "You chose to leave the world behind." "I didn't choose anything," I shouted, my fear giving way to anger. "I just wanted to get home. I didn't—" "You cannot go back," the figure interrupted, its tone cold and final. "Once the journey begins, it cannot be undone." I shook my head again, tears welling in my eyes. "No, this isn't fair. I didn't know." "Few do," the figure said, its voice softening. "But the choice was yours." I staggered backward, my mind reeling. My heart pounded as the weight of its words sank in. The bus, the passengers, the chanting, all of it had been leading to this moment, to this place. The figure extended a long, spindly arm, gesturing toward the open door. "Step through, and your journey will end." "And if I don't?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it simply waited, its featureless face unreadable. The light beyond the door pulsed softly. Beckoning, I stared at it, torn between the fear of what lay ahead and the hopelessness of turning back. The whispers returned, faint and distant, urging me toward the light. That I took a step forward, that I took another hesitant step toward the glowing doorway, the light washing over me in faint pulses that matched the rhythmic thrum of the ground beneath my feet. The figure didn't move, its elongated form standing unnaturally still. Its presence was oppressive, like it was watching me not with eyes but with something far more invasive, something that could see every hidden corner of my thoughts. My foot hovered at the threshold. The light spilled out from the door like a living thing, brushing against my skin in waves of icy heat. It wasn't comforting or warm. It felt alien, like it was probing me, testing my resolve. The figure spoke again, its voice a low vibration that seemed to echo inside my chest. "Beyond lies the end of your journey. Peace awaits. Step forward." "Peace," I repeated, my voice trembling. "What kind of peace? What's on the other side?" The figure tilted its head, the movement almost curious. "What lies beyond is not for you to know until you cross. To return would mean chaos, endless wandering in the void. To step forward is release." Its words churned in my mind, their implications sinking deep. I glanced back over my shoulder, hoping for some other option, some other path I could take. The void behind me was as impenetrable as before, a vast nothingness that stretched on endlessly. There was no way to retrace my steps. The bus was gone, swallowed by the dark. But even as I considered the door, something tugged at me. An instinct, a primal warning not to trust what was being offered. "Peace. Release." The words sounded hollow, a veneer stretched too thin over a truth I couldn't see. I turned back to the figure. "Why me? Why am I here?" Its head tilted further, a grotesque, almost serpentine gesture. "You boarded the bus. That is enough." "That's not an answer," I snapped, my frustration surging. I didn't know what I was getting into. I thought it was just a ride home. The figure's form shimmered faintly, its edges blurring like heat waves rising from asphalt. Intent is irrelevant. The choice was made. The journey began. I clenched my fists, anger and fear mingling in a storm that left me shaking. You're saying there's no way out? No way to go back? For the first time, the figure hesitated. Its stillness wavered, its form shifting slightly as though it were considering its response. There is another path, it finally said, its voice softer now. But it is not without consequence. The air grew colder as the figure's words hung in the stillness. What other path? I demanded, desperate for any alternative. The figure raised a long, spindly arm and gestured toward the darkness to my left. As I turned to follow its motion, a faint glimmer appeared in the void, smaller and weaker than the light from the door, but unmistakable. It flickered like a distant flame, struggling to stay alive. That path leads away from the journey's end, the figure said, its voice now tinged with something I couldn't identify. It is not a path of peace. It is the road of defiance, a choice that few make and fewer survive. What happens if I take it? I asked, my voice trembling. The figure did not answer immediately. Instead, the pulsating glow from the door seemed to intensify, the light spilling out in surges that made the air hum with energy. When it finally spoke, its voice was low and resonant, weighted with warning. To step off the intended path is to reject the end. It is to wander where the lost dwell, to face what lurks in the unseen corners of the void. There will be no peace, no rest, no certainty. Only a chance to escape or to be consumed. The flame in the distance flickered again, brighter for a moment before dimming once more. My heart raced as I stared at it. It was so far away, so faint, but it was there. A glimmer of hope or a trap. I turned back to the figure, my voice steadier than I expected. Why tell me this? If you want me to step through the door, why even show me another option? It remained silent for a moment, and when it spoke, its tone carried a strange note of regret. You were told not to look back, yet you did. You were warned to leave before it was too late, yet you remained. Those who question the journey must be shown the full truth. The words sent a chill down my spine. I thought back to the whispers on the bus, the figure in the last row warning me not to look back, the old woman's trembling hand pointing to the door. Each warning had come too late, given when I was already ensnared. The figure continued, its voice dropping lower. Few choose the path of defiance. Fewer survive it. Those who do are no longer the same. My legs felt like lead as I turned my gaze back to the distant flame. It flickered faintly, as if mocking my indecision. My mind reeled, caught between two impossible choices. Step through the door to a promised peace I didn't trust, or follow the faint light into the unknown. The thought of the door, the figure's promise of an end to this nightmare, tempted me. But that primal warning persisted, a voice deep inside me screaming that stepping through was a mistake I couldn't undo. I'll take the other path, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't react immediately. It stood silent, its elongated form still and shadowy. When it finally moved, it stepped aside, clearing the way to the glowing door. Then go, it said, its voice colder now, devoid of the strange empathy it had carried before. Follow the light if you dare. But know this, once you leave, there will be no return. Not to the door, not to the journey, not to the world you left behind. I swallowed hard, the weight of its words pressing down on me. I turned away from the glowing door, forcing myself to ignore the pulsing light and the strange, almost magnetic pull it exerted. The distant flame was barely visible, a tiny, fragile spark in the vast darkness that I took my first step toward it. The air seemed to shift immediately, growing heavier, colder. The rhythmic thrum of the ground faded, replaced by an eerie, pervasive silence. The flame flickered again, its faint glow illuminating strange shapes in the darkness. Jagged, angular shadows that seemed to twist and writhe as I approached. My chest tightened as I moved forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. The ground beneath me felt different now, no longer smooth and polished but rough and uneven, like shattered glass. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint echo of my footsteps. The flame grew brighter as I drew closer, but so did the shadows around it. They moved faster now, darting and shifting just beyond the edges of the light. I could feel them watching me, their unseen gazes pressing against my skin like cold fingers. The figure's warning echoed in my mind. There will be no peace, no rest, no certainty. Only a chance that I gritted my teeth and kept moving, the flickering flame my only guide. The faint flame pulsed ahead, a fragile point of light amidst the sprawling darkness. Each step toward it felt like a rebellion, an act of defiance against something vast and incomprehensible. The ground beneath my feet became harsher, sharper, as though the void itself resented my choice. Every step sent jagged pain shooting up my legs, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The oppressive silence that had replaced the rhythmic hum of the bus wasn't empty. It carried weight, an unseen presence that pressed against me from all sides. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, darting closer each time I glanced away. They were formless, like smoke caught in an invisible wind, but their intentions were unmistakable. They were watching, waiting. The flame flickered brighter as I neared, illuminating the jagged shapes of the ground around it. What I'd taken for uneven stone was something far worse, bones. The ground was a chaotic tangle of bleached and splintered remains, stretching as far as I could see. The brittle crunch beneath my feet made my stomach twist, but I forced myself to focus on the light that it wasn't until I was almost upon the flame that I saw it clearly. A lantern perched precariously atop a pile of shattered bones. Its frame was rusted and twisted, its glass cracked and stained, but it burned with a steady, unwavering glow. The shadows writhed more furiously around it now, as though enraged by my approach. I reached for the lantern, my fingers trembling as I wrapped them around its cold metal handle. The instant I lifted it, a sound shattered the silence, a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the void. The shadows surged. They came at me from all sides, an onslaught of writhing black shapes that moved with impossible speed. My heart thundered in my chest as I stumbled backward, the lantern's glow barely holding them at bay. Each shadow that touched the light recoiled with a hiss, its edges fraying like smoke in the wind. But the light wasn't enough to keep them all away. They circled me like wolves, testing the limits of the lantern's protection, their movements growing bolder with each pass. One darted toward me, its formless body stretching into a claw-like appendage that swiped inches from my face. Instinct took over. I swung the lantern wildly, its glow carving a brief arc through the darkness. The shadows retreated for a moment, but they regrouped just as quickly, their numbers seemingly endless. The growling grew louder, a chorus of guttural sounds that seemed to come from every direction at once. I turned and ran. The bones beneath my feet crunched and splintered as I fled, the lantern's light flickering wildly with each desperate step. The shadows pursued me, their movements chaotic and frenzied, like a storm of living darkness. I didn't know where I was going. There was no path, no destination, only the primal urge to escape. The lantern's light barely pierced the void ahead, revealing glimpses of the treacherous terrain. The ground rose and fell unpredictably, jagged spires of bone jutting out like twisted sculptures. I stumbled frequently, the sharp edges tearing at my skin, but I pushed forward, the growls growing ever closer. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately regretted it. The shadows had coalesced into something more solid, more monstrous. Their formless bodies now sprouted limbs and faces, horrifying parodies of human features. Eyes that burned with cold fire, mouths that stretched too wide, filled with rows of jagged teeth. They weren't just chasing me, they were hunting me. The terrain began to change as I ran, the bones giving way to a smooth, featureless expanse. The ground here was cold and reflective, like black glass. My footsteps echoed eerily, each one a reminder of how alone I was in this endless void. The shadows slowed their pursuit, their monstrous forms flickering and distorting as they reached the edge of the bone field. They hesitated, prowling at the boundary like predators unwilling to cross into unfamiliar territory. I didn't stop to wonder why. I kept moving, my legs burning and my lungs heaving with the effort. The growls faded into the distance, replaced by a different sound. A faint, rhythmic tapping. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder with each step. It was coming from somewhere ahead of me, and it wasn't random. It had a pattern, a deliberate cadence that made my skin crawl. Tap.
Top, top.
Tap. I slowed my pace, the lantern's glow casting long, flickering shadows across the glassy ground. The tapping continued, steady and insistent, drawing me closer despite every instinct screaming at me to turn back. Then I saw it that a figure stood in the distance, barely visible in the faint light of the lantern. It was tall and impossibly thin, its silhouette warped and distorted like a reflection in shattered glass. One of its elongated arms held a long, jagged staff, which it tapped rhythmically against the ground. Tap.
Top, top.
Tap. The sound echoed in my chest, resonating like a second heartbeat. The figure didn't move as I approached, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as though studying me. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It remained still, its faceless head turned toward me, the tapping of its staff the only sound. I tightened my grip on the lantern, the light flaring briefly in response. The figure flinched, its head snapping upright with a sharp, cracking sound. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice a low rasp that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You defy the path. You defy the journey." I took a step back, the lantern's glow flickering as the figure took a step forward. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, as though it were fighting against invisible strings. "I didn't want this," I said, my voice shaking. "I just wanted to leave. I didn't—" "You chose?" the figure interrupted, its voice cutting through the air like a blade. "And now you will face what waits." It raised its staff, and the glassy ground beneath me began to crack. The fractures spread quickly, jagged lines splintering outward in every direction. The reflective surface shuddered beneath my feet, threatening to give way. The figure stepped closer, its elongated limbs twisting and contorting, its faceless head tilting once more. "You will not survive," it said, its tone almost mournful. "But perhaps that is mercy." I didn't wait for it to strike. The fractures beneath me widened, and I ran, the lantern's light swaying wildly as I sprinted across the unstable terrain. The tapping resumed behind me, faster now, more urgent, each strike of the staff sending tremors through the ground. The glass shattered, I fell. The world splintered around me as I plunged into the void below. Shards of the glassy ground floated alongside me, their jagged edges catching the faint glow of the lantern as I tumbled through the air. Time stretched and twisted, the sensation of falling endless and suffocating. My lungs burned with the effort to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. The shadows were with me, spiraling through the darkness like hunting birds. Their distorted forms flickered in and out of view, their monstrous faces twisting into grotesque mockeries of human expression. They didn't attack, but they didn't need to. Their presence alone was suffocating, a reminder that I was hopelessly out of my depth. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fall ended. I hit the ground hard, the impact rattling through my bones. The lantern slipped from my grip, its fragile glow flickering weakly as it rolled across the surface. The ground here was unlike anything I'd felt before, soft and yielding like damp soil, but with a strange elasticity that sent faint ripples beneath me as I struggled to my knees. The air was different, too. It was heavy and thick, each breath feeling like I was inhaling smoke. I coughed violently, my chest tightening with every gasp. The shadows circled above, their forms blending into the oppressive darkness, but they didn't descend. They seemed to be waiting for something, or someone. I reached for the lantern, my trembling fingers brushing against its rusted handle. Its light flared briefly as I lifted it, illuminating the world around me. What I saw froze me in place. I was in a cavern, but it was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The walls stretched upward into infinity, their surfaces slick and pulsating as though alive. Veins of sickly green light coursed through the rock, casting faint, shifting patterns across the uneven ground. The air hummed with an unearthly energy, a low vibration that made my teeth ache, and in the distance, at the center of the cavern, stood a figure that it was the same one I'd seen before, the tall, impossibly thin being with its warped silhouette and jagged staff. But here, in the cavern's twisted light, it seemed even more alien, its form shifting and stretching like a mirage. Its faceless head turned toward me, and though it had no eyes, I felt its gaze pierce through me. "You run from the journey," it said, its voice resonating through the cavern. "You defy the end. But there is no escape." I gripped the lantern tightly, its faint warmth the only thing keeping me grounded. "I don't belong here," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "I didn't ask for this." The figure tilted its head, its movements unervingly smooth. "You chose to board the bus. You chose to step away from the path. Every action has led you here." "That's not a choice," I shouted, anger rising in my chest. "I didn't know. None of this was explained. You can't punish me for something I didn't understand." The figure's form shimmered, its edges blurring like smoke caught in a breeze. "There is no punishment. There is only the journey. And now you must face its conclusion." It raised its staff, and the ground beneath me began to ripple. The pulsating light from the walls grew brighter, the veins of green energy writhing like serpents. The shadows above descended, their monstrous forms closing in with terrifying speed. I turned and ran, the lantern's light casting long, flickering shadows as I sprinted across the unstable ground. The cavern shifted and twisted around me, the walls narrowing and expanding in unnatural ways. Every step felt heavier, the ground pulling at my feet like quicksand. The shadows were relentless, their distorted forms darting closer with every passing second. One lunged at me, its claw-like appendage raking across my arm. Pain seared through me, the wound burning as though it had been touched by fire. I stumbled but kept moving, the lantern's faint glow the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. Ahead, the cavern opened into a massive chamber. At its center was something I couldn't fully comprehend, a swirling vortex of light and shadow, its edges crackling with raw energy. It pulsed with a rhythm that matched the pounding of my heart, drawing everything around it into its chaotic orbit. I didn't know what it was, but I knew one thing. It was my only chance. The shadows screamed as I approached the vortex, their guttural cries reverberating through the chamber. They surged forward, their forms twisting into monstrous shapes, but the lantern's glow kept them at bay. I reached the edge of the vortex and stopped, the sheer power of it forcing me to shield my face. "Do not enter," the figure's voice boomed, louder and more commanding than ever. It appeared at the edge of the chamber, its staff raised high. "The vortex is chaos. It is oblivion. To step inside is to be unmade. And if I don't?" I shouted back, my voice barely audible over the vortex's deafening roar. The figure didn't answer. Its form flickered, its edges fraying as though the vortex's energy was unraveling it. The shadows closed in around me, their monstrous faces twisted with rage and hunger. I looked at the vortex, then back at the figure. My mind raced. There was no peace waiting for me, no safe path forward. The door had been a lie, the shadows relentless. And this was the only choice left. That I tightened my grip on the lantern, its light flaring one last time as I stepped into the vortex. The sensation was indescribable. Every part of me was pulled in 1,000 directions at once. My body and mind stretched to their limits and beyond. Light and shadow swirled around me, merging and splitting in patterns I couldn't comprehend. I felt myself unraveling, my thoughts fragmenting into shards. But in the chaos, there was something else, something small but undeniable. A spark, a fleeting sense of hope, buried deep within the storm. I focused on it, clung to it, letting it guide me as the vortex threatened to tear me apart. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. I awoke on cold, damp pavement. The sound of distant traffic filled the air, and the faint glow of streetlights illuminated the world around me. I was back in the city, lying near the same bus stop where it had all begun. The lantern was gone, as were the shadows and the figure. My arm throbbed where the shadow had struck me. A faint scar, the only evidence of what I'd endured. I stood shakily, the weight of the journey still pressing on me. The city felt different now. Emptier, quieter, as though something vital had been stripped away. But I was alive. I had made it out. As I turned to leave the bus stop, I noticed something scratched into the metal bench nearby. For simple words, carved deep into the surface. Don't look back again.